Well, today we are joined by Troy Bredenkamp, the Senior Vice President of Government and Public Affairs for the Renewable Fuels Association. Troy, thanks so much for joining today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm happy to do it.
So just kind of getting into it right here, we are here to talk about ethanol. I know there's a lot of questions just kind of floating around about what is going on in the industry. And just starting off here, looking at production, I mean, weekly production numbers are showing that output, while due to seasonal maintenance as being one thing, is lower than previous years. Kind of looking at, the lowest in 8 years specifically with certain weeks. Corn used for ethanol production is, for the first 16 days of the marketing year, was down 8%. From what you've seen, what has kind of been the overall sentiment from ethanol producers? I know we've had a lot of high corn prices lately.
Well, we certainly have, and obviously it's going to be a disappointing corn crop, and I think that's probably driving a lot of what we're seeing in terms of a little bit lower run rate and just trying to stretch, I think, last year's crop and then kind of figuring out what this year's crop is going to look like, and I say unfortunate because I've heard from a lot of our members and it by and large, it's been a really good ethanol year. It's been a good year for the corn farmer. It's been a good year for the ethanol plant. And had this crop come in, like they normally do, I think everything would have been full steam ahead. But because we're looking at, a pretty substantial drop in the overall national crop, and the carryover from last year is getting pretty lean. I think everyone's just trying to settle in and kind of figure out what the end of 2022 and obviously the rest of 2023 is going to look like from a corn availability perspective, and then they'll have to adjust production from there.
And kind of even looking on the demand side, I know they're looking at those gas demand numbers as well. It seems like we're kind of scaring away some consumers there. Are they kind of trying to cover their bases there as well?
Well, I think so. Although we've had, relatively pretty good demand, all things considered. We came back out of the pandemic. We hit some pre-COVID, consumption numbers, which is always a good thing to see. Obviously backed off a little bit when gas prices went so high, so yeah, I think there's a lot of factors coming into this equation for the producer moving forward. Obviously looking at what the global demand might look like, if we're heading into a couple recessionary quarters, and even from a global recession perspective, the thought is there is going to be a dip in demand, and so everyone's trying to plan ahead, and then obviously when you're looking at the high corn price and maybe some of the basis that some of the drier spots are going to need to be dealing with, I think everyone's trying to sharpen the pencil and figure out what they need to do for the rest of the year.
Kind of moving back, talking into a little bit of the future now. I mean, in August, President Joe Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act. While that had a large sticker shock, there was money put aside for the biofuels industry, specifically that $500 million to USDA for infrastructure, for blending, storage, distribution, all that for E15 and E85. Are you really seeing that, or do you see the benefits for that for helping in future demand as well?
Oh, absolutely. From an Inflation Reduction Act perspective, and I know, there's folks all over the board on that particular piece of legislation. We were focused just on the biofuel provisions within that package. And from that perspective, we like what we saw, and we like what ultimately was included in that bill. You mentioned the higher blend infrastructure, $500 million for higher blend steel going in the ground. Clearly, from a long-term perspective, that we feel that's a good thing for the market. Allowing those higher blends and the availability for the consumer to actually be able to choose those higher blends, I think is important. So that was a very positive thing. You look at the carbon capture, utilization, and storage provisions within there from a 45Q perspective. We really do see the future of ethanol being in a low carbon space. And so that's going to obviously help us reach a net zero by 2050 or sooner pledge like the RFA members have put forward. And then you look at the new tax credits. You look at the sustainable aviation fuel tax credit, and the ability for corn-based ethanol to play a role in taking alcohol to jet fuel down the road. That's obviously a real opportunity moving forward. And then finally, you had the clean fuel production credit. Again, based on a performance standard, based on a carbon score perspective, we feel very good about where corn-based ethanol could play down the road in that kind of a market. So top to bottom, from a biofuel perspective, we really feel good about what was included in the Inflation Reduction Act and the opportunity for ethanol and other biofuels to play a pretty huge role moving forward in a low to no carbon market.
And keeping along those lines with the, long-term outlook, and also in that bill was support for electric cars as well. And now recently we had the report that California is now banning, new car sales of gasoline motors by, I believe, 2035. Do you foresee that kind of cutting into ethanol demand when we're trying to move towards, the cleaner fuels, where some states are now trying to just lean into no fuels?
Well, I mean, potentially, yes. I mean, and there's some things that some states are doing, like banning the internal combustion engine, that clearly we're disappointed with and we do not support. We feel like if you're going to be if your focus is on lowering the carbon emissions, then let's make that a technology neutral approach, and let's do it based on a performance basis. I mean, even though an electric vehicle is called a zero emission vehicle, we know that the power, the energy that charges the battery, and frankly, the inputs that it takes to actually create that battery or create that vehicle are not carbon free. And so, getting a platform, a even playing field when it comes to, technology neutral approaches, I think is important. Having said that, we knew that the Inflation Reduction Act was going to be very heavy on the EV side. We were just happy to see the inclusion of the biofuel components. And like I said, even from a low carb performance-based standard, we feel pretty comfortable about being able to compete with electric vehicles long term. When you are looking at a complete life cycle analysis of that carbon, and you take where the battery needed to come from, where the electricity needs to be generated in order to recharge that battery, all those components going into it, versus the life cycle assessment of today's corn-based ethanol, we feel good about our opportunity to compete in that market long term. So I understand what you're saying. There was certainly a lot of good things in there for electric vehicles, but there also was some challenges put in there. When you look at the sourcing requirements of the electric vehicle components needing to be from North America, those are going to be some challenges, I think, that the electric vehicle industry has yet to figure out how they're going to meet. So there's some things that may, look on the surface to be very pro EV. There are also some challenges that they have moving forward with some provisions within the IRA.
And even looking at that, even if states were to shift towards more EVs, just saying that, and you mentioned it's the standard aviation fuel and everything like that, when it comes to trying to find new ways for biofuels to kind of have a role. Some people are kind of suggesting almost an RFS 3 that kind of focuses on different things that are, harder to, decarbonize, kind of thing. Is that something that might come up in conversations down the road?
I think there will. I haven't heard an RFS 3 concept, but we certainly are involved in several exploration processes that center around a clean fuel standard. So if you look at a clean fuel standard, again, I keep coming back to this technology neutral approach, this life cycle assessment approach. But when you do it right, and we feel like it could be done right, when it's done right, we feel very good about where biofuels, and in particular, even corn-based ethanol, can play a huge role moving forward. As the corn farmer continues to lower that carbon score as he's growing that corn, as the ethanol plant continues to do its things with efficiencies, and then obviously carbon capture, utilization, and storage being that final piece. we feel very good about where ethanol can get to from a net zero or even a carbon negative perspective. And I don't know of another energy source out there that can actually be carbon negative at the end of the day. So what doors does that open up? Well, this new door that I wouldn't even known the acronym 18 months ago, SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel, is one of those. This hard to electrify space. You look at your heavy duty off-road equipment, your trucking, all these things can be utilized and can utilize ethanol if our carbon score is lower. And there's ways to do that. That moves us outside of that light duty vehicle gas tank and into other uses. So that's why I think, even though you on one side feel like there's some headwinds coming toward the biofuel and the ethanol industry when it comes to electric vehicles, there's huge opportunities moving forward in these, as you said, hard to electrify spaces, jet alcohol to jet fuel. And obviously, marine, train, and heavy duty transportation needs. So we're pretty excited about where this future might go for us.
All right, and I know we talked a lot about the future, but kind of rounding it back here to end is talking about trade and more short term. I mean, recently we had U.S. Census Bureau data come out. RFA came out with the same data that the trade monitor showed that August ethanol exports were down 28% to 77 million gallons from the previous month. But Canada kind of did a lot of, push up and trying to keep those elevated a little bit. Even with that, are you seeing some significant numbers of that, kind of continuing lower or kind of seeing a positive there? So essentially, are you just kind of seeing bullish, bearish, kind of what's your outlook there?
Well, it's a great question, and again, I think it goes back to where this global demand might be headed. I think everyone's posturing, everyone might be pausing ever so slightly to kind of figure out what is this recession, this global recession, if that's indeed what we fall into, will look like. How long will it last? Obviously, folks that are in that business don't want to be sitting on a supply for something that there's been a decrease in the demand. So I think that probably speaks to the dip that we've seen. We would expect that to moderate over the last quarter of this year. Yeah, probably won't necessarily tick up much, but certainly I don't think it gets worse. And we're coming off a pretty good export year last year, so we have to probably keep that in mind as well. Everything coming back out of COVID was pretty rocketing straight up, and now we're kind of getting back into that normalcy here in year two post COVID. And I think it's a lot of the expectation of what's going to happen with this global demand if indeed we do fall into a global recession. So don't want to say bearish or bullish, but I think we're just going to stay the course and be pretty steady and probably come out for an average export year by the end of December.
Right. And hopefully some things to look forward to. And once again, appreciate the insights. And that's, again, Troy Bredenkamp with the Renewable Fuels Association. Thank you for your time, Troy.
Thanks for having me.